Interlude, Ashes and Whispers. From the journals of Lieutenant Henri Valois, found frozen in the snows of Smolensk, Moscow burned for 5 days. We thought the fire would die, but it grew, as though the city itself prayed to the flame. The dead with us began to stumble. They crumbled into ash. Their eyes, once lit with pale fire, went dark. I marched past a regiment of skeletons that had carried our guns since Spain. They lay in heaps now, nothing left but scorched bone. Some said the saints had struck them down. I begin to think it is true. A Russian peasant woman, testimony collected near Vyazma. We left bread on the tables. We left icons on the walls. Then we walked into the woods and prayed. We did not see them enter, but we saw the smoke. The bells rang as if the city itself cried out. My grandfather said the French were not men, but shadows in uniform. He spat when he said the emperor's name. He said, God will freeze him where he stands. Letter never sent. Sergeant Pierre Gautier, 57th line. My dearest Marianne, we are rich, they say. We have silver, we have silks, we have all Moscow. But it is a tomb, Marianne. No music, no laughter, no children. I tried to pray, but the words feel foreign now. I only hear the whisper of the maitre in my dreams. And when I wake, the emperor is there, staring into the fire as though he commands it. Some say he no longer sleeps, some say he cannot. An Orthodox priest, speaking to General Kutuzov, do not fear the legions of the dead. Fire has scattered them. Winter will finish them. The saints have turned the land itself against the invader. Their emperor has bargained for shadows, but shadows cannot march through snow. Kutuzov bowed his head. His single eye glistened. Then let the snow fall. Rumor in the French camp whispered from tent to tent. The emperor spoke to the fire. The fire answered. The smoke of Moscow drifted across the plains, blackening the sky. The Grande Armée lingered too long in the ruins, and when at last it turned westward, the first snowflakes were already falling, and the snow did not melt. Chapter 9. The Retreat from Moscow. The first snow fell as the Grande Armée left the smoking carcass of Moscow. At first it seemed harmless, a thin dusting, soft upon the shoulders of men and horses. Soldiers even laughed, tossing flakes at one another, dreaming perhaps of Paris winters, of hearths and wine. But within days, the laughter was gone. The snow deepened, the winds sharpened, and the laughter froze in their throats. The road west became a graveyard trail. Napoleon rode at the head, his cloak pulled tight, his face hard as granite. Around him, the revenants stumbled, their movements sluggish, frost creeping across their bones. Joints cracked. Fingers snapped like brittle twigs. The maitre muttered incantations ceaselessly, but his voice wavered in the blizzards, as if the storm itself drowned him out. Something resists me, the necromancer whispered one night, kneeling by a campfire that refused to burn. The cold is not natural. It is a judgment. Napoleon did not answer. His eyes were fixed west, but his mind drifted east, back to Moscow's burning domes, to the voices in the fire. He clenched his gloved hand until his nails broke skin. The army disintegrated as it marched. Men gnawed on horseflesh raw. They stripped bark from trees, boiled leather, chewed powder-blackened scraps of bread. Wounded soldiers begged their comrades to kill them, but were left behind in the snow instead, their cries fading into silence. The dead, once tireless, faltered. Frost crept through their marrow, their bones shattered under the weight of ice. Some collapsed entirely, brittle statues left behind along the road, frozen in eternal salute. Others turned feral, breaking from formation, clawing at the living, driven mad by some new hunger the Metra could not soothe. At Smolensk, the rearguard fought not only Cossacks but their own revenants, corpses gnashing through French ranks until cannon fire tore them apart. Soldiers whispered that the necromancy itself was unraveling, the pact fraying under God's frost. Napoleon pressed forward, eyes hollow, voice iron. "We do not stop," he said, even as men fell dead in their tracks. "We do not stop," he repeated, when cannon carriages froze fast to the ground. "We do not stop," he commanded, even as the Maitre whispered that the shadows would not last another week. The Emperor's presence alone drove them on, that and fear. His marshals muttered in the snow, their loyalty splintering. Some spoke of mutiny. Some spoke of abandoning the necromancer, casting off the curse. But none dared speak of abandoning him. The nights grew worse. Wolves followed the column, their howls rising with the wind. Soldiers swore the beast's eyes glowed with holy fire, as if Moscow's martyrs had taken fur and fang to hound them. Entire companies vanished into the dark, never to return. Around the dying campfires, men whispered prayers. Others cursed God outright, turning to the Maitre in desperation. But his rituals brought no warmth, no bread, no salvation. Only more whispers in the dark. One night, as the wind screamed through broken trees, Napoleon stood alone upon a hill of snow, watching the faint glow of the army's fires below. His breath steamed in the moonlight. "Are you satisfied?" he said softly to the night itself. "Is this enough sacrifice for your mercy?" No answer came, only the snapping of frozen branches, the moan of the wind. Yet Napoleon felt something watching, vast and implacable, older than gods or kings. Not Russia, not winter, something deeper. For the first time, he shivered. At Vyazma, the Grande Armée became a mob. Revenants staggered like scarecrows, limbs breaking with every step. The living fought among themselves for scraps of food, bayonets clashing, brothers killing brothers. Women and children, camp followers who had trailed the army since Paris, Endez, fell in heaps, their bodies used as fuel for fires that smoked but did not warm. Kutuzov's armies pressed from the east, Cossacks slashed from the flanks. Yet more terrifying than Russians were the snowstorms themselves, blizzards that erased entire battalions as though they had never marched at all. "Not war," a dying grenadier whispered as he froze against a cannon wheel. "This is not war. This is erasure." The Maitre staggered beside Napoleon, mask rimed with ice, voice weak. "The dead slip from me, sire. I can no longer command them. This land, this winter, it is older magic than mine." Napoleon turned to him, eyes blazing. "Then bind the living. Bind them all, if you must. France must not fall here." The necromancer bowed, but in his heart he wondered, had the Emperor already bound himself? Was his soul already shackled to this endless frost? By December, the Grande Armée was no longer an army but a procession of wraiths. Living and dead alike staggered westward, shadows against the snow. And still Napoleon rode at the front, his gaze fixed beyond the horizon, as though he saw Paris waiting, though all others saw only night and the wolves that followed. The retreat had begun, but for many, it would never end. Chapter 10. The Berezina. The river was black with ice. The Grande Armée, or what remained of it, stood upon its banks, a ragged multitude of frost-bitten shadows. They had marched through snow and silence, through wolf and blizzard, through hunger so deep it hollowed the soul. Now, at last, they faced the Berezina. On the far bank, Salvation, Lithuania, the road to safety, to France. Behind them, Kutuzov's armies pressed near, Cossack riders nipping at their heels, Russian guns already booming in the distance. Between them and survival lay the river, frozen only in patches, currents roaring beneath black water. To cross would mean salvation or drowning. Napoleon rode to the bank. His face was gaunt, eyes burning with fevered fire. Around him, the dead shambled still, though most were broken things, frostbitten corpses, stumbling without command. The matron knelt beside the river, whispering in tongues that steamed upon the air, trying to still the waters. The Berezina roared louder in answer. "There is no time," Marshal Ney muttered. His lips were blue, his beard frozen stiff. "The Russians are upon us. We cannot build bridges. We cannot cross." Napoleon's gaze did not waver. "Then we must make a bridge." The maitre looked up sharply. His mask was cracked, frost clinging to the bone. "Sire, I cannot raise what the river takes. Its flow belongs to older powers. Even I cannot." "Not the river," Napoleon cut him off. His voice was iron, final. "The men, the dead, the living, all of them. Bind them into one. Make them a bridge." A silence fell, heavier than the snow. Soldiers nearby turned pale. One dropped to his knees, whispering the rosary. Others stared, too cold, too broken to protest. The maître hesitated. His voice was hollow. "This is beyond blasphemy. This is damnation." Napoleon leaned close, eyes burning with inhuman light. "France does not drown in this river." And so the work began. The maître drew his knives, slicing his palms, letting blood drip into the snow. His chants rose above the storm, ancient syllables tearing through the night. Soldiers screamed as shadows gripped them, pulling them to their feet, driving them toward the water. The living walked willingly, or not at all. Some tried to flee. Bayonets stopped them. Others staggered forward, blank-eyed, compelled by the emperor's gaze. The dead shambled with them, silent, obedient. Together, they stepped into the freezing current. The river took them, and yet did not. Flesh hardened, bones locked, bodies interwoven in impossible geometry. They froze into place, arms outstretched, faces locked in agony. One by one they sank into the current, but their bodies did not vanish. They fused, layer upon layer, until the first timbers of a bridge emerged. The Grande Armée began to cross. Men shuffled across the grotesque span, boots clattering on skulls, slipping on frozen flesh. Some wept, others vomited, others crossed in silence, their eyes hollow. Horses balked, then were driven forward, hooves crushing ribs. Cannon wheels grated over spines. All the while, the river groaned beneath, the current tearing at the bridge of corpses, pulling free arms, legs, faces, only for more bodies to be driven down to replace them. And through it all, Napoleon watched, his expression unreadable, as though he stared not at horror, but at inevitability. The Russians arrived before the last had crossed. Cannon fire tore through the mass of soldiers, throwing men screaming into the current. Cossacks swarmed the bank, sabres flashing, but Ney and his rearguard held firm, muskets cracking, bayonets thrusting. The bridge trembled, groaned, threatened to break. The maître poured the last of his strength into the spell, his voice cracking with blood. His hands shook, his eyes bled. But the bridge held. For 3 days they crossed, under cannon fire, under blizzard, under screams. For 3 days the Berezina drank its fill of Frenchmen. By the end, the river ran red beneath the ice. On the 4th day, the last cannon rolled across. The rearguard stumbled after, their numbers fewer still. The bridge of corpses shuddered, groaned, and broke. With a roar like thunder, the Berezina swallowed it whole. Thousands remained on the far bank, abandoned. Their cries echoed across the water, then fell silent as Russian steel descended. Napoleon stood upon the western shore, his cloak stiff with frost, his face pale as marble. Behind him, the Grande Armée was no longer an army, but a remnant, ragged, broken, a ghost of empire. The Maître collapsed at his side, his mask shattered, his breath shallow. "It is done," he rasped. But the price, Napoleon silenced him with a glance. His eyes burned still, brighter than ever, though what fire it was, no mortal could say. "We march," he said. His voice was steady, implacable. "France still lives." And so the shadows moved west once more, leaving the Berezina black with the dead, the river forever whispering their names beneath the ice. Chapter 11. The Shadow on the Throne. Paris received him in silence. The city's bells tolled as Napoleon returned, but their notes were hollow, uneasy. The streets were crowded, with faces pale from hunger and fear, yet no cheer rose from them. They stared as the emperor passed in his carriage, as though they looked upon not a man but a phantom. And perhaps they were not wrong. Napoleon had grown gaunt, his uniform hanging loose upon him, his skin waxen, his eyes burning with unnatural fire. Where once his presence filled the streets with iron will, now a hush followed him, as though his very shadow drained warmth from the air. The Grande Armée was gone. What stumbled behind him into France were scarecrows in uniform, soldiers who no longer slept, who flinched at every whisper of wind, who muttered prayers in their sleep, or curses. Mothers pulled children away as they passed. Dogs growled, then whimpered. Paris whispered, "He brought them back from the grave, and he brought something else with him." In the Tuileries, Napoleon sat alone at his desk. Maps lay before him, ink smudged by frostbitten fingers. Reports arrived hourly of Prussia stirring, of Austria conspiring, of Britain waiting like a vulture. His marshals no longer met his gaze for long. They remembered the Berezina. They remembered the bridge of corpses. In the dead of night, he spoke to himself, or perhaps not to himself. "You promised me victory," he whispered into the dark. "You promised me empire without end. Was this your design? To crown me in frost and silence?" From the shadows of the chamber came no voice, yet the silence pressed back, as heavy as snow. Napoleon's hand trembled once, before he forced it still. "I am not broken," he said aloud, though his breath smoked in the candlelight. "France still breathes. Europe will bow." But in his heart, he remembered Moscow's fire. He remembered the river's scream, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether he had commanded shadows or whether shadows had commanded him. Outside, Paris slept uneasily. In alleyways, beggars swore they saw soldiers with eyes like hollow lanterns, still marching though their hearts no longer beat. Priests whispered that winter itself had followed the emperor home. Children dreamed of wolves beneath their beds, their howls echoing from the east. And in the palace, as dawn touched the Seine, Napoleon stood at the window, his silhouette sharp against the paling sky. The city below did not stir. The river glimmered, dark and silent. For the first time, the emperor's shadow seemed longer than the man himself, stretching across the floor, across the room, reaching beyond stone and city, reaching eastward, back toward the snows. It trembled, then moved, though Napoleon himself did not, and Paris slept on, unaware. Chapter 12. The Emperor's Gambit. The war room beneath the Tuileries Palace had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the generals who once planned campaigns within its walls. Where maps of European battlefields had once hung, now strange charts covered every surface, astronomical calculations, phases of the moon plotted against ancient calendars, and diagrams of Paris marked with symbols that predated Christianity itself. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the center of it all, no longer merely the Emperor of the French, but something far more ambitious. The candlelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames, and his eyes held a depth that spoke of communion with powers beyond mortal understanding. Mon Dieu, General Murat whispered, crossing himself as he entered the chamber. What has become of this place? Napoleon turned, and when he smiled, Murat noticed that his teeth seemed sharper than before, more predatory. Progress, mon brave Murat. Evolution. The shedding of mortal limitations. The Emperor gestured to the largest map, where Paris lay rendered in exquisite detail. Dark lines radiated outward from the city's heart, like a spider's web, each strand pulsing faintly with its own inner light. Behold the grand design that will reshape not merely Europe, but the very nature of power itself. Marshal Ney stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing alarm. Emperor, these markings. They seem to move on their own. Because they are alive, Michel. Each line represents a conduit of the spreading shadow, channels through which flows power that originates from the ancient peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. Napoleon's voice carried an otherworldly resonance, made his officers shift uncomfortably. There, in caves that honeycomb those primordial peaks, dwell entities that witness the rise and fall of Rome, that remember when the Druids held dominion over all Europe. He moved to a smaller table where ancient texts lay open, volumes bound in leather that looked suspiciously like human skin, their pages covered in scripts that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. For months, I have been in correspondence with these elder powers. They showed me visions of what I could become, of the empire I could build if I were freed from the constraints of mortality. Napoleon's eyes grew distant, remembering. Alexander wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, but he was thinking too small. Why conquer space when you can conquer time itself? General Junot, who had served with Napoleon since the Italian campaigns, found his voice. Sire, this talk of immortality, surely you don't believe such things are possible? Napoleon laughed, a sound that seemed to echo from far deeper within his throat than it should. Believe? Mon cher Junot, I have already begun the transformation. Each night, the shadow grows stronger within me. I feel my mortality burning away like dross in a furnace, leaving behind something pure, eternal, divine. He strode to the great map of Paris, his finger tracing the concentric circles that marked the city's arrondissements. The ritual of the 7 circles requires a focus of immense spiritual significance, a place where millions of souls have lived, loved, suffered, and died. Paris is perfect. Every street holds memories, every building resonates with human emotion. And when the moon reaches its dark phase on the feast of St. Bartholomew, all of that accumulated spiritual energy will be mine to command. Marshal Ney stepped closer to examine the map, his soldier's mind trying to comprehend the strategic implications. These symbols at each intersection, what do they represent? Anchor points, Napoleon replied, his voice taking on a lecturing tone as if he were back at the military academy. The shadow flows like water, but it requires channels and reservoirs. Each major intersection in Paris will serve as a focusing lens, concentrating the power and directing it toward the central ritual site. And where will that be? Murat asked, though his expression suggested he dreaded the answer. Napoleon's smile widened, and for a moment his face seemed to flicker between human and something else, something with too many angles and shadows that moved independently of any light source. Notre Dame Cathedral, naturally. What better place to overthrow the old order than in the very heart of Christian France? The irony is exquisite. The room fell silent, save for the crackling of candles and a sound that might have been distant whispering, though no one could identify its source. Finally, General Junot found the courage to voice what they were all thinking. "Sire, what of the Empress? What of your soul?" Napoleon's expression softened momentarily, and for an instant he looked almost human again. "Josephine. Yes, she troubles me. There is still too much of the old Napoleon in me, I fear. I find myself attached to mortal concerns." He shook his head sharply, as if clearing away cobwebs. "But such weaknesses will be burned away in the final transformation. As for my soul," he moved to a mirror that hung on the far wall, an ancient piece of polished obsidian that reflected not light, but something else entirely. In its dark surface, Napoleon's reflection showed not the familiar figure of the French emperor, but something tall and terrible, wreathed in shadows that moved like living things. I have learned that the concept of soul is far more fluid than the priests would have us believe. What they call corruption, I call evolution. What they term damnation, I recognize as transcendence. When the ritual is complete, I will be more than Napoleon Bonaparte, more than any emperor who has ever lived. I will be eternal, unchanging, perfect. Marshal Ney backing toward the door, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "And what of France? What of your people?" The thing in the mirror turned to look at him, and Ney gasped as he realized those shadow-wreathed eyes were looking directly at him, not at Napoleon's position by the wall. "They will serve," Napoleon said simply, his voice now coming from both his physical form and the reflections simultaneously. "Those who embrace the shadow willingly shall be rewarded with their own measure of immortality. Those who resist, well, even the most stubborn materials can be refined with sufficient heat and pressure." General Murat crossed himself again, this time more openly. "Sire, I have followed you through Italy, Egypt, Austerlitz, Wagram. But this is not victory. This is evolution," Napoleon roared, and suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, and the shadows cast by the candles grew long and dark, reaching toward the officers like grasping fingers. "You think too small, all of you. You measure success in miles of territory conquered, in armies defeated, in crowns accumulated. But I will measure mine in centuries, in millennia." He gestured to the maps, and the dark lines pulsed brighter, as if responding to his passion. Already, the shadow spreads through the eastern quarters of Paris. Thousands have embraced it willingly, recognizing the gift I offer them. They serve now with a devotion no mortal emperor has ever inspired, because they understand that I offer them something no mortal emperor ever could: eternity itself. The whispers in the air grew louder, and now the officers could make out words, fragments of prayers spoken backwards, names of saints invoked in blasphemous contexts, and underneath it all, a rhythmic chanting in languages that predated Latin. "The feast of St. Bartholomew is in 3 weeks, Napoleon continued, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "By then, every soul in Paris will have made their choice, serve willingly, or be compelled to serve. And when I stand at the altar of Notre Dame and speak the final words of binding, the shadow will flow through every street, every building, every heart in this city, and through them it will flow into me. General Junot was openly weeping now, though he seemed unaware of his tears. What have you become, sire? What has happened to the man who led us to glory across Europe? Napoleon approached him slowly, each footstep echoing strangely in the chamber. When he placed his hand on Junot's shoulder, the general gasped at how cold it was, not the cold of winter, but the absolute cold of the void between stars. That man was weak, mortal, limited. He dreamed of conquering Europe when he should have been dreaming of conquering death itself. But he served his purpose. He brought me to this moment, to this choice, to this glorious transformation. Napoleon's grip tightened, and Junot could see frost forming where those fingers touched his uniform. And now, mes amis, you must make the same choice he made. Embrace the shadow willingly and share in its gifts. Resist and, well, the shadow has ways of compelling obedience. The candles began to flicker more violently, and in their dancing light, the officers could see that Napoleon's shadow on the wall behind him was writhing, expanding, taking on a life of its own. Within its dark depths, other shapes moved, tall figures with burning eyes and voices that spoke in harmonics no human throat could produce. Choose, Napoleon commanded, and his voice was now a chorus of whispers. Choose now, before the choice is taken from you. Marshal Ney drew his sword, the steel ringing as it cleared its sheath. I choose to remember my oath to France, not to whatever you have become. Napoleon sighed, a sound like wind through a cemetery at midnight. So be it, mon vieux ami. But know that your resistance is temporary. In the end, all will serve, all will kneel, all will embrace the eternal darkness I bring. The shadows on the walls began to move independently of their sources, reaching toward the defiant officers like grasping tentacles. But just as they were about to engulf the men, Napoleon held up a hand. No, not yet. Let them go. Let them carry word of what they have seen. Fear, after all, is almost as useful as loyalty, and far easier to cultivate. His smile was terrible to behold. Besides, I want them to witness the ritual. I want them to see the birth of their new god. The shadows retreated, and the temperature in the room began to return to normal. But the whispers remained, just at the edge of hearing, and the dark lines on the maps continued to pulse with their malevolent life. 3 weeks, Napoleon repeated, and now he was looking directly at each officer in turn, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like a cat's. 3 weeks until everything changes forever. I suggest you use that time wisely, to prepare your souls for service to something greater than any mortal emperor. As the officers fled the chamber, Napoleon turned back to his maps and charts, his fingers tracing patterns in the air above them. The symbols responded to his gestures, glowing brighter, and through the windows, the lights of Paris seemed to flicker in response. Soon, he whispered to powers that dwelt in the spaces between shadows. Soon, I will take my rightful place among you, and this world will know what it means to be ruled by the eternal. In the obsidian mirror, his reflection smiled back at him with far too many teeth.